In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, before I begin, I'd just like to say thank you for Brother Musharraf for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for everyone turning up today. So today's topic is important to those people that are interested in ethics and also concerned about living a moral life and being a moral person, and also living in an ethical society. On the topic of ethics, Socrates in Plato's Republic has been noted as saying, "We are discussing no small matter, but how we ought to live." And this ought to live is just as important today as it was in 400 BC. You see, ever since the Enlightenment, modern man has tried to free himself from the shackles of religion. He felt repressed by God, constrained by God, and felt that he didn't need God anymore. But what we have to understand is that that has implications. At the time of modern man, when he started to challenge these ideas, he challenged the idea of an intermediary, an intercessor between man and God. When they did away with the clergyman, when they did away with the priest, then they asked, well, why do we need God to begin with? Friedrich Nietzsche, the infamous 19th century philosopher, he proclaimed at this very time the death of God, and with it all destruction of meaning and purpose in man's life. In my view, Friedrich Nietzsche had great foresight. He predicted what we're experiencing today in our secular, postmodern societies. The current malice, moral malice that we're experiencing becomes apparent through the most cursory of glances at the social ills in our society that are plaguing us right now. Prevalence of substance abuse, alcoholism, drug abuse, teenage pregnancy, violence, the list goes on. What we're experiencing right now is a mess that's left after a party gone mad. Modern man's party, the aftermath of a rebellion against God. What Friedrich Nietzsche was so clear about, what he was so able to see in that time that others failed to see, was that the people that were talking about living life without God, it's all very well talking about living life without God, but there comes a price. Those very same people that were saying, we don't need God anymore, they had a Christian heritage of morality that they were living by. And the next generation, what would they receive? When they killed off God, what would they receive? They received a relic of the past. Tradition without the grounding of God retains very little value. The Prophet, peace be upon him, he mentioned a time, and in this hadith, very interesting, he says, there will be a time when the slave girl will give birth to her mistress. Now scholars have understood from this that there will be a time where the social norms will be turned upside down, an upheaval of social norms in our society. So the good becomes bad and the bad becomes good. Virtue becomes vice, vice becomes virtue. SubhanAllah. You can see in our day-to-day where people are walking around with t-shirts, with insults, and they're proud of it. Many years back, if you called someone some of these names, I don't want to mention them now, they'll be insulted. Even in our movies, even our superheroes have lost their morality. Who's seen Superman Returns? Who's seen Superman? Okay. Superman's one of my favourite characters. When Superman returns, he leaves all his moral principles wherever he was. Because he encounters a Lois Lane, his sweetheart, and she's married. And what does he do? He still pursues her, knowing full well that she's a married woman. So in the 1960s, Superman stood for truth, justice, and the American way. And now, in the 21st century, Superman commits adultery. And it's perfectly acceptable. So, ethics and morality is not some abstract idea. It affects all of us around us in the society that we're living today. So we should all be engaged with it, especially being Muslim. So, what I'd like to do today is look at Islam and atheism with respect to morality. And we want to look at 3 subpoints. The first point is objective moral values, objective moral duties, our second point, and lastly, objective moral motivation. So when we talk about objective moral values, what we mean is that there are some things that are good and evil. This is an actual reality. There are some things that exist that are good and evil. An example of that would be that the Holocaust was objectively morally wrong. Okay? Now, and even if the Nazis thought it was right, it was still objectively morally wrong. Now let's partake in this kind of thought experiment for a second. Imagine now that the Allies were unsuccessful, and the Nazis were successful, and they took over the world, and they exterminated everyone that disagreed with them, and the whole world was populated with Nazis. Would the Holocaust still be deemed evil? Objectively wrong?
No. No.
Yes, it would be. Because objective morality, objective values transcend what we think about them or not. Okay, it's very important here. We're not talking, you see, sometimes people talk about the moral high ground, which is an understanding that someone subscribes to a universal law. This is not going to be sufficient in understanding what we're talking about today. What we're talking about is that there exists good and evil that transcends whether we believe in it or not. Even if the whole world said the Holocaust was objectively right, it would be still wrong. Now, for such values to exist, they need to be grounded somewhere. So according to the both worldviews, Islam and atheism, can they be grounded? Well, in the case of Islam, the Islamic perspective is that there is an all-powerful, all-knowing entity known as Allah, who has created the man and universe. Now, Allah's nature, He is compassionate, generous, kind, forgiving. This is Allah's nature. And He has essential properties. Essential properties, what do we mean by that? What we mean is, without those properties, He would cease to be that thing. Okay? So for example, this table has an essential property that has a density. Without a density, it will cease to be a table. Now Allah has those properties within Him. Like for example, He is the just. He's Al-Karim, the generous one. Al-Rauf, the compassionate. Al-Bar, the doer of good. This is Allah's nature. This is what He is. So Allah's nature provides us that foundation for those values that we acknowledge in the world today. Allah's paradigm is that absolute standard that we could gauge all manner or form of action. So we can see that Islam provides that grounding. We're safe here when we're talking about moral values and when we have Islam to go by. Now Allah, who is that locus of morality, what does He do? He creates insan. He creates insan and bestows upon him a sense of specialness, a sense of moral worth. In Surah 17, verse 70, Allah says, "We have honoured the children of Adam and carried them by land and sea. We have provided good sustenance for them and favoured them, especially above many of those we have created." So what this verse is saying is that at this point, Allah, who imparts this transcendent dignity on mankind at this point of creation. And what does our tradition tell us? It says that if one person is killed, it is as if the whole of humanity is killed. Here, at the creation story, we understand that human life has intrinsic value. Life is sacred. Human beings have a specialness. Now, the question is, but if God does not exist, and atheism is true, can we have a foundation? Can we believe that these values of good and evil exist? And more importantly, can human beings have a sense of moral worth? Well, the most popular version of atheism is naturalism. That is, that they believe that anything that exists They hold that anything that exists can be discovered using our scientific methods. Okay? But the problem here is that science is amoral. What we're looking for is moral properties. Now, moral properties, they don't have a size, a shape, a density, a touch, a smell. They're not made from particles, they're not chemicals. So science can't discover these properties that we're looking for. You can't find morality in a test tube. The late J.L. Mackie from Oxford University, a prominent atheist philosopher of the previous century, he confessed. He said, moral properties constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely not to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. Now let's look at Mackie's reasoning here. He's arguing, he's saying, look, if all we have is atheism, then, and that good and evil do exist, then it would be very hard to show it up in a world that is made up by chemical and physical law. How are we going to discover these things? Now, just to illustrate that point, suppose we went back to the history of the cosmos, and the universe, according to the atheist worldview, popped into being, uncaused, just exists there. Obviously, as Muslims, we disagree with that point, but that's time for another lecture. But let's just, for argument's sake, go along with this story. Popped into being, uncaused, then started to create these particles, and these particles formed these stars and planets and galaxies. And out of those planets, one planet had the correct conditions to have life being formed. Objects that have life existing within those planets. Now, it would be easy to ask, and Brother Musharraf is a scientist, it would be easy to ask why those objects were made from carbon and nitrogen. Because all you have to do is look at the structures of the structures and explain those. And you can explain that quite easily. But notice that the history of the cosmos is nothing more than a description. It is. This is the case. This and this came together and formed this. What we're looking for is ought to be the case. Ought to do and ought not. This is a completely different type of knowledge. So, how do we explain for these oughts in the universe? If you start with is, all you end up with is. You can't have oughts. Moreover, in the absence of God, what is man? Does man have any specialness? No. Man, human beings, all they are is an accident, a byproduct of a lengthy evolutionary process. What are we? We're advanced primates, after all. If there is no longer a distinguishable way of looking at man, if we can't distinguish man through his condition, then he joins the ranks of the animal kingdom. He is nothing more than a member of the mere animal species. That's all he is. The distinguishing factor between man and animal disappears. The line becomes merged. That's all he is at the end of the day. Now, humanists ground moral worth and these objective values in human beings. But the valorization of man, to give man some special meaning, is what we call speciesism. Why? Because the same process, blind process of chance and necessity that produced humans also coughed up rats and amoebas. But we don't give any kind of moral worth to these creatures. So how can that follow that we give special meaning to human beings? If we examine man under a microscope, what would we discover? Stephen Hawking has described man or human beings as just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet. That's all we are. That's all we can be if God does not exist. If we take man and we want to find out his secret of being, and we put him under a microscope, and we strip away the layers, all we will discover is flesh. All that we can possibly be is a computer made from flesh. That's all we are, essentially. Now, if all we are is just matter, and that we're just, let's say, at most, complex matter, then what does that mean? What is the implication of that? Well, all that means is that, say for example, a bomber jet flies over a village in Afghanistan and bombs a village, and an entire family is killed. All that really happens, technically, is a rearrangement of those molecules. That's all we are. Because qualitatively, we're no different from apes. Qualitatively, we're no different from a rock. At the end of the day, if you just have matter, all that you can have is pure matter. But even if we accept, let's say for example, I'm being too harsh, even if we accept that there are such things as of objective moral values in an atheistic worldview. Imagine if they exist for a second. That does not help us when we start to talk about objective moral duties. Now, objective moral duties are those things that are right and wrong. They're to do with our actions. Like, for example, if I stood up and punched this brother, I would never do that, but we can say, hey, that was wrong. But if I stood up and I gave the brother some money, then you say that was right. These are objectively right and wrong. Who and what would impose these moral duties upon us? Why would there exist these kind of oughts and ought nots? Where would they come from if all we had is atheism? You see, in the case of Islam, we have, again, sound basis for objective moral duties. Allah, as one of another essential property, is Al-Hakim. He is the ruler. He is the judge. Now, Allah's moral nature expressed to us in the form of divine commands constitutes our moral duties. In the Quran, Surah 12, verse 40, the command is for none but Allah. God has commanded you to worship no one but Him. In Surah 22, verse 36, if anyone disobeys God and God's messenger, that person is clearly on the wrong path. So the important point here is this, is that Islam provides us a lawgiver. A lawgiver. And what that means is that laws can be substantiated in the world today. So the point is, if there is no lawgiver, then how can we have laws? And in atheism, there is no such thing as a lawgiver. The late Richard Taylor, who wrote many books on the topic of ethics, an atheist, he says, a duty is something that is owed, but something can be owed only to some person or persons. There can be no such thing as a duty in isolation. The idea of political or legal obligation is clear enough. Similarly, the idea of an obligation higher than this, and referred to as a moral obligation, is clear enough, provided reference to some lawmaker higher. But what if this higher than human lawgiver is no longer taken into account? Does the concept of moral obligation still make sense? The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. So what is Richard Taylor saying here? Look, he's saying, look, we can talk about right or wrong all day long, but if no one imposes them on us, there's no meaning whatsoever. As I mentioned earlier, that from the atheist perspective, all we are is advanced primates. But again, the problem here is that if we are relegated to the animal kingdom is amoral. Animals are not moral agents. For example, who's seen a cat play with a mouse? And when it's bored with the mouse, it kills the mouse, right? I don't think any of us here would accuse and trial the cat for torture. It doesn't work that way. Or when a shark forcefully copulates with another shark, we don't say the shark raped the shark. We don't speak in those terms. But then why would those behaviors be forbidden in human relations? If we're just animals, then why would that not carry over? Some may argue that, hey, we do have morality. We do have this kind of herd morality. We see in the animal kingdom, we see baboons, for example, a troop of baboons exhibiting this kind of altruistic behavior, this kind of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back kind of behavior. We see that happening all the time in the animal kingdom. And the cousins, the Homo sapiens, have followed suit because it perpetuates the development of the species and the existence of the species. But that just means that the behavior that we're experiencing, that we can observe in the animal kingdom and within our own societies, is just a spin-off of socio-biological evolution. Michael Ruse, a noted philosopher, concludes by saying this: the position of modern evolutionists is that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands, our feet, and our teeth. Considered a rationally justifiable set of claims of objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate when somebody says, love thy neighbour as thyself. They think they are referring to above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, their reference is truly without foundation. Morality is an aid to survival and reproduction. Any deeper meaning is illusory. And to underscore that point that there's nothing special about us, and therefore nothing special about the way that we behave, and that this kind of altruistic behavior is not moral. If we were to rewind the history of human development, the history of human evolution, and play this again, there might be other things that might be seen as being advantageous for the perpetuation of the human species. Darwin wrote in The Descent of Man, if men were reared under the precise conditions of bees, our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their mothers, or would strive to kill their fertile daughters. And no one would think of interfering. So Darwin here, what he's saying is, look, it just so happens to be the case that these things that we exhibit seem to be that perpetuate our species. So how can they be moral? How can they be objective in any way? So ultimately, what that means is that acts like rape and incest may be socially disadvantageous, but that doesn't mean that they're objectively wrong. They're just taboos at the end of the day. Paul Kurtz, a humanist, writes that in The Forbidden Fruit, the moral principles that govern our behavior are rooted in habit, customs, feeling, and fashions. So, our morality without God is just custom, fashion, and habits. If that's all that we have, then what do we say to the person who wants to flout in the face of the herd morality, that wants to go against fashion? What do we say to that person who says, well, I think it's advantageous to rape people. I think it's a great thing, we need to go ahead and do it. What do we say to that person? All we can say to him is that you're acting unfashionable, you're going against custom. He's not objectively morally wrong. Now, it's, for example, if someone stood up now and passed wind, now we would say that to that person, well, listen, you're quite unsociable, you're socially inept, but we wouldn't make a moral judgment on that person. We wouldn't say, we wouldn't morally condemn them. We'd just say, look, you're going against that custom, no one does that. Or someone, for example, when we're eating at the dinner table and someone burps very loudly, we wouldn't say, hey, you're objectively morally wrong for doing such a thing. We'd say, look, that's not the etiquette. But that's all that happens when atheists talk about morality without God. If there's no grounding, that's what happens to our moral duties. They're reduced to just etiquette. But what is etiquette without any grounding? So without that grounding, all we have is subjective expressions of personal taste. What is right for you is not right for me. What is moral for you might not be moral for me. For example, when I say, I think that chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream, I am saying something true because it reflects my subjective appreciation of that thing, which is the ice cream. So we have a subject and an object. Now notice that I don't say anything outside of me. that ice cream does not taste, I taste. Similarly, when we see actions in the outside world, outside of ourselves, when we make those moral judgments, all they are subjective expressions. There's nothing objectively true about them. So in that case, if all we have is subjectivism and possibly relativism, what that means is that we can't condemn. Because to condemn means that you have an objective framework, an objective grounding to condemn someone. How can you have a moral high ground if everything is on the same plane rather? It doesn't work that way. That means that we can't condemn the likes of Hitler, we can't condemn oppression, we can't condemn crime without that foundation. But even if we said that objective moral values do exist and objective moral duties do exist from an atheistic perspective, essentially morality is still inconsequential. What do I mean by that? Well, firstly, from an Islamic perspective, Allah holds all people morally accountable for their actions. Evil will be punished, righteousness will be rewarded. Despite the inequities of this world, Allah will balance the scales of justice, and good will triumph over evil. In Surah 11, verse 103, there truly is a sign in this for everyone who fears the punishment of the hereafter. That is a day in which all people will be gathered today, a day for all to see. Surah 7, verse 8, on that day, the weighing of deeds will be true and just. Those whose deeds are heavy on the scales will be ones to prosper. So what that means is that our decisions in this life are infused with the hereafter. The decisions to be moral and immoral have great significance. But from the atheist perspective, morality and being moral is irrelevant. Why? Because life ends at the grave. We all end up 6 feet under, our heads beside the tombstone, all of us. So it doesn't matter whether you live like a Salah ad-Din or a Stalin. We're all ending up in the same place. Moreover, acts like self-sacrifice, where they have great significance from the Islamic worldview, in the Islamic worldview. They're great significance because we know that Allah will reward us on the Day of Judgment. But they become nonsensical if atheism is true. The acts that we see people committing self-sacrifice are just nothing more than hardwiring as a result of evolution, as a result of the socio-biological conditioning throughout the years. For example, when a fireman risks his own life to save someone from a burning building, or a policeman who risks his own life to save his comrade, these are no more morally praiseworthy than, let's say, an ant who risks his own existence to save the ant heap. Now, this hardwiring of evolution for self-destruction may have been useful at one point in the evolutionary process to, let's say, to perpetuate that particular tribe. But it has very limited scope. But now that we're no longer slaves to the socio-biological pressures of self-destructive activity, why should we choose not to act in our own self-interest? Why should self not be king? The philosopher of religion, John Hick, writes, and he illustrates this point. He says, suppose him to be called upon to immolate himself for the sake of the anthill. He feels the powerful pressure of instinct pushing him towards his self-destruction. But he asks himself why should he voluntarily carry out the suicidal program to which instinct prompts him. Why should he regard the future existence of a million other ants as more important to him than his own continued existence? Since all that he is and has, or ever can have, is his own present existence, surely in so far as he is free from the domination of blind force, of instinct, he will opt for his own life, his own life. So why should human beings choose any differently? As atheists, we only have one life, one shot. Make the most of it. As the philosopher Ayn Rand, the late philosopher Ayn Rand, said that it was a virtue to be selfish. She said that it's stupid to go against your own interest. There are some people that argue that we are motivated. There is some kind of motivation from an atheist perspective that to guarantee the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people. But why is the egoist wrong? The egoist who is only concerned for his own happiness. Why is he wrong? According to Islam, that would be wrong, because we have a duty upon us, and we will be accounted if we don't think for others. But if atheism is true, why would the egoist be wrong? All he has is his life. Some may argue that, hold on a minute, it may be in your interest to be moral. That we exhibit some kind of moral behavior because it's in our interest and we get something in return. But that's not what morality is about. Morality is not about doing good deeds so that we get something in return. So what morality is reduced to is dividends. You get a payback. That's all that the only reason that you exhibit these moral behaviors is that you get something in return. I'm sure all of us here have in some stage in their lives been faced with a situation that goes directly against self-interest. And self-sacrifice, let's say, counters that self-interest. I'm sure that we have experienced that before, but we know that acting morally sometimes means going against the wind. And it's hard to make moral choices. It's not always about getting something in return. And we know that's not morality. R.Z. Friedman, a philosopher from the University of Toronto, concludes, without religion, the coherence of an ethic of compassion cannot be established. The principle of respect for persons and the principle of the survival of the fittest are mutually exclusive. They're not compatible. So if this is the case, putting aside showing compassion and being good, what about being bad? There's nothing to stop someone being bad. Why would someone stop being bad? What is the moral motivation to stop oneself from committing the most heinous of crimes? If one does not believe that there is an ultimate accountability one day. From the atheistic perspective, we simply have to accept that there will be actions carried out in this world that will never be accounted for. Torture, child abuse, rape, they just end at the grave. We have to simply accept this. We have to simply accept the inequities of this life and the unbalanced scales of justice. As the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, then everything goes. Wow, it's quite bleak. What do we say to those people that went against and fought against Hitler and died for justice? All that they died for was for vain. It was all vain. There was nothing there. If life just stops at the grave, then what's the point? Why do you have your own interest? For example, Rachel Corrie, who flew halfway across the world for people, the Palestinians, that she would never ever meet in her life. And whether the Palestinians are being bulldozed or not would never affect her life. But why did she go all the way there? From an atheistic perspective, it was all in vain. There's no point. Well, why would anyone want to do that? Why would you risk your life? There's nothing to get at the end of the day. So in the absence of moral accountability, self-sacrifice and compassion is futile. So to conclude, atheism cannot provide us a sound foundation for objective moral values, and more importantly, very important note here, objective moral worth for human beings. Objective moral duties cannot be grounded, and they are relegated to a realm of subjective expressions of personal taste. And ultimately, morality is inconsequential from an atheist world view, or within an atheist world view. But there's light at the end of the tunnel. Whereas Islam is concerned, from the Islamic perspective, our morality, moral values are grounded in God. Where reason alone fails to give any specialness to human beings, the creation story, the point of creation, bestows upon man a specialness about him, meaning moral worth, and guarantees that dignity where reason alone fails. Allah's nature expressed in the form of divine laws constitutes those moral duties that we so need. And at that point, what we can say is that there is a real meaning, there is a real difference between right and wrong. There is a difference between showing love to a child and abusing a child. There is an actual difference. When we have a grounding for objective moral duties, what that means is that we can praise acts of generosity, kindness, charity, and we can condemn selfishness, hatred, and discrimination. And objective moral motivation is secured as Allah holds all people to account and ultimate justice prevails. Thank you.
MashaAllah.